Welcome to another YouTube video. How exciting. Hope you've had a great week. I hope you've enjoyed the previous two videos that we've done. The mechanisms of hypertrophy and reverse dieting. Very useful, I think, if you apply what I was speaking about. Anyway, this video is going to be about training intensity, the RPE scale, which stands for the rate of perceived exertion, and the RIR scale, which stands for reps in reserve. Now, training intensity is important, and it's probably one of the areas that I think people lack the most, right? Over my years as a coach, but also just a normal gym goer and observing other people in the gym, a lot of people are just going to the gym and going through the motions, right? They're doing their sets, they're doing their reps, but they're not demanding enough, which of course means that no adaptations are going to occur. So the whole purpose of this video is just to outline, the importance of training intensity, certain things that you can look out for when you are training to show that you are pushing yourself with enough intent, and some subjective tools that you can use to, again, gauge your training intensity. So, look, whenever you're trying to build muscle, there are two variables that you should really focus on, right? Volume and intensity. Volume is the reps and the sets. Pretty easy, to manage that. As I said, a lot of people are just going through the motions, counting their reps, counting their sets, but they're not seeing progress. And that's probably due to the fact that they're not training with enough intensity. So intensity is how hard you are pushing yourself, right? The load that you are using, the proximity to failure that you are reaching on each given set. So I'll just jump into it, right? You want to be training hard. You want to be training close to failure. There's a big debate in regards to, do you need to train to failure on every set to build muscle? The answer to that is no, you don't. You need to be training close to failure, okay? It is okay if you want to train to failure on a very often basis, but that does come with an increased risk of injury and an increased risk of overtraining and, just sort of annihilating your central nervous system, which is not good, right? We always want to sort of encourage training longevity and continuity. So I do take some sets to failure personally, usually on certain machines and cables, but other movements like compound multi-joint exercises, training to failure is not going to be a very good idea. Taking back squats to failure or bench presses to failure all the time, really suboptimal. So look, one thing you can look out for when you're training, as you're nearing the end of a set, is velocity loss in the rep. All right, your last rep should always be slower than your first rep. Okay, if your last rep is the same speed as your first rep, then that is a clear indication that you're not training with enough intensity. Okay, so velocity loss is something key. You know what I'm saying? For example, when I'm doing a back squat, by my last rep, it's very much slower than the first rep, right? And that's a key indication that I use that I'm training close to failure, okay? As I said, I don't want to go to failure on certain movements like the back squat, but when my sets start to slow down, that tells me that I am sort of, pushing into a territory which is going to cause and drive adaptations. So the tools that you can use to gauge your training intensity, of course, are subjective, right? So you need to be careful here. But we have the RPE scale, which runs from 1 to 10. 1 meaning, no exertion at all. Very simple. You can have a conversation whilst you're doing the movement, right? 10 out of 10 is failure. So you've tried to execute a rep and you have failed that rep. You have not finished it. Now, on the most part, you want to be working 7 to 9. On the heavy compound movements, like a back squat, a bench press, a military press, you probably want to be working around 7 to 8, I would say, out of 10. Now, on machines, cables, right, where there's an increased degree of stability and the risk of injury is slightly lower, if you do fail a rep, you can push further, maybe 8 to 9, even 10 sometimes, as I've said. Okay, now in correlation with the RPE scale, you have the RIR scale, which stands for reps left in reserve. So if you're finishing a set aiming for 8 out of 10 on the RPE scale, that means you would have, in theory, 2 reps left in reserve, right, until you get to 10 out of 10. on a back squat, if you're training to an RPE of 7 out of 10, then you would have, again, 3 reps left in reserve. So, you know, sort of gauging things that way, right? If someone, this is a sort of question that I ask myself sometimes. If I had a gun to my head and the person was like, do as many reps as you can, how many more would I be able to do? You know what I'm saying? And that helps me calculate my reps left in reserve. Okay, so again, they are subjective, and you know, sometimes I train people and I ask them, how was that set on the RPE scale? And they say, oh Ben, that was an 8. And then I usually correct them and I say, no, that was a 5 or a 6. So, you know, you do need to calibrate your RPE scale before you start using it. And a good way to do that is just to check yourself on some machines, maybe the leg extension or a chest press machine, and just go to failure. You know, teach yourself what training to failure actually feels like, right? As you're sort of getting more fatigued, right? So gauge your scale before you apply it, and that's gonna help massively. Okay, so RPE, RIR, oh my God, tools that sort of go together, right? And you could use one to sort of calibrate the other one, okay? But on heavy compound movements, as I've said, probably aim for around 7 to 8. You don't want to train as close to failure because the risk of injury is greater, okay? Whereas on machines where there's more stability and there's a decreased risk of injury, you can train closer to failure, 8 to 9, or even 10 out of 10 sometimes. Now, depending upon your goal as well, if your goal is hypertrophy focused, then yeah, slightly closer to failure is you know, the study suggests is more beneficial, right? But if your main goal is strength development, then the data suggests you don't need to train as close to failure. Instead, you know, you should focus on the sort of mechanics of the movement, optimal form, load management to sort of develop the strength. So that's, well, probably a whole different video. But I imagine if you're watching me, the main goal is hypertrophy, to get bigger. So yeah, go along with what I've just said. But if you are just purely looking to get stronger like a power lifter, then yeah, training as close to failure is not necessarily needed. But as I said, that's a different video. Now, one last thing that I want to talk to you about is the range of motion. Now, this only really applies to machines and cables, and I've spoken a lot about this on my Instagram, but as you're getting closer to failure, you know, let's say you're doing a set of 15 on the machine fly, the pec deck, right? As you get closer to failure and as fatigue sets in, as long as you've calibrated the weight correctly, you know, it's going to be very hard to work through a full range of motion, right? So as you get more fatigued, as you get higher up on the RPE scale, and as you get closer to the end of the set, it's okay if the range of motion diminishes. So I'm trying to give you a practical example now without looking like an idiot, but you're getting closer to the end of the set, the range of motion will diminish, and by that last rep, you know, this is the only range that you're working through. And that's not because you're consciously doing that, it's because the muscle is so fatigued, right, that you're unable to maintain proper form. This is something that I learned from Chris Bumstead, who of course knows a thing or two about building muscle. But yeah, when you are sort of, you know, trying to sort of max out on reps, or you're sort of on a machine and you want to train to 9 or 10 out of 10, it's okay if the range of motion diminishes, right? Just maintain your form and the target muscle is still going to be taking the load. All right, very important. So I think that covers everything. I could keep talking, but I'm getting bored of the sound of my own voice, if I'm honest. So to summarize, look out for velocity loss in the repetitions as you near the end of a set. The last rep should always be slower than the first. The last rep should always be slower than the first rep, okay? If the last rep is the same speed as the first rep, then you can increase the intensity, right? You can do that in a multitude of ways, but a simple way is just increasing the load that you're using. Someone's moving tables upstairs, which is noisy. RPE, rate of perceived exertion. For heavy compounds, 7 to 8 out of 10. For machines and cables, 8 to 9 or even 10 out of 10. RIR, reps in reserve. That correlates quite nicely with the RPE scale. For heavy compounds, maybe train with around 3 reps left in reserve. For machines and cables, you know, 1 to 2 reps left in reserve. And I know that sounds quite similar, but trust me, when you're doing heavy squats, 3 reps left in reserve compared to 2 reps left in reserve is a big difference, all right? Don't be scared to, you know, chuck yourself on a machine every now and then and go to failure just to recalibrate. Because don't forget, as you get bigger and as you get stronger, your ceiling is going to continually be raised. So every, maybe once a month, just recalibrate what 10 out of 10 actually feels like for you. And that's going to, move the ceiling, and it's going to move all of the other numbers up a bit more, okay? And yeah, don't worry about the range of motion diminishing. And this is only on machines and cables, remember? Obviously on a back squat, you don't want the range of motion to diminish, because then you'll just be stuck at the bottom under a heavy weight. But when you are using machines and cables, it's okay if the range of motion gets smaller. All right? Hope that all makes sense, but don't overlook training intensity. In my professional opinion, it is the most overlooked area to people building muscle, and it's one of the main reasons, or lack of, right, that people don't have the body that they want. Make sure your sessions are hard. Make sure your sets are intense. When you finish a workout, you should be very grateful that it's over. Okay? Don't forget to like and subscribe, and any comments or questions pop below.